I had imagined that morning 1,000 times in my head, played it over like a carefully rehearsed film, every detail carved into my imagination with the precision of someone who believed in fairy tales. The dress, with its lace sleeves and delicate embroidery, had been hanging in my closet for months, waiting to finally see the light of day. The flowers, lilies and roses mixed with sprigs of lavender, filled the air with a soft scent that clung to my skin as I sat before the mirror, my hands trembling just slightly as the makeup artist gave final touches. Everyone around me was glowing with excitement. My bridesmaids, my mother with eyes full of pride, my father fighting tears, and me. I was floating in that strange mixture of joy and terror that comes when a lifetime of waiting gathers itself into a single moment. I remember holding my breath when I first heard the string quartet begin the soft prelude, the notes filtering through the heavy church doors. I tightened my grip on the bouquet, trying to still the pounding of my heart, telling myself it was nerves, telling myself this was it, the day I would become someone's forever. He was waiting at the altar, or so I believed, and all I had to do was walk down that aisle. The doors opened, and for a brief shining instant, the world seemed perfect. Faces turned, whispers of awe followed my steps, and the train of my dress brushed softly against the floor like a whispered promise. His eyes met mine, and I swore I saw the familiar tenderness there, the love we had built through years of laughter, sacrifices, and dreams of the future. But then, like a candle snuffed out in a draft, everything shifted. At first it was so subtle I thought I had imagined it. A stiffness in his posture, a glance over my shoulder, the way his smile faltered just as I was halfway down the aisle. I slowed, confused, but still hopeful, still clinging to the story I had told myself. Then, in a blur that no one could have scripted, he stepped back. Not just a shuffle of nerves, not a momentary hesitation. He turned his face, pale with a decision I could not yet comprehend, and the room seemed to inhale in unison. The whispers swelled like a rising tide, and before I could process the betrayal, he muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't hear but felt like a knife twisting in my chest. And then he walked. He walked away from me, from the vows, from the altar, from the life we had planned, and every step he took was like the crack of a whip, each echo marking the collapse of everything I believed in. The doors did not close gently behind him. They slammed, and with them shattered every illusion I had ever nurtured. It is difficult to describe the silence that followed, a silence so deep it felt like the whole church was holding its breath, unwilling to exhale until someone made sense of what had just happened. My bouquet slipped slightly in my hand, petals brushing against the fabric of my dress, and I stood frozen, caught between disbelief and humiliation. The faces around me, some full of pity, others tinged with curiosity, burned into my skin like 1,000 unspoken judgments. I felt stripped, exposed in the cruelest way, abandoned not in private, but before an audience of everyone who mattered, everyone who thought they had come to witness love, but instead saw betrayal. Somewhere, a child began to cry, the sound slicing through the silence, and it was then that my body remembered to breathe. In the haze of my shock, I caught sight of her. She was there, seated toward the back, almost hidden but not enough. Her eyes glittered, not with shame but with triumph, and the faintest smirk curved her lips as she rose to follow him. The mistress, the shadow I had ignored in half-formed suspicions, the phantom I had dismissed as paranoia, now revealed in flesh and blood as the reason my world had collapsed at the altar. She did not flinch beneath the weight of dozens of stares. She did not bow her head in embarrassment. She walked proudly after him, as if she had won a prize that was once mine, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to claim what she thought belonged to her. The sting of that image seared deeper than the slam of the church doors, because in her eyes, I was nothing more than the discarded shell of a defeated woman. I cannot recall how long I stood there, staring at the space he had abandoned, my mind desperately clawing for explanations. Seconds felt like hours like lifetimes, as the ceremony disintegrated into whispers and shifting seats. My father moved first, stepping toward me, his voice breaking through the suffocating quiet, offering his arm like a lifeline. My mother's tears streamed silently, her hands trembling as she tried to reach me, but I could not move. My feet were rooted to the spot where my future had just been ripped away, and every fiber of me screamed to collapse, to break, to let the grief swallow me whole. Yet I did not. I straightened my spine, forced my trembling chin upward, and breathed in the suffocating perfume of flowers that now felt like mockery. This was supposed to be the day I dreamed of, the day I would step into a new life with the man I loved. Instead, it became the day I was humiliated before everyone I knew, left behind like an afterthought while he chose another. But what I did not yet know, as I stood frozen in my wedding dress, was that the story was far from over, that within hours, the man who had walked away so confidently would return to me, broken and crying, unaware that the woman he had left at the altar was no longer the same. The dream had shattered, yes, but in its place something colder, stronger, and far more dangerous was beginning to take shape. The moments that followed his exit blurred together in a haze that felt both excruciatingly slow and violently fast, as though time itself no longer obeyed natural order, but instead pulsed to the rhythm of my humiliation. I remember standing there, unable to move, while the whispers around me multiplied into a chorus that reverberated off the church walls. Some tried to mask their curiosity with pity. Others allowed the raw hunger of gossip to shape their expressions, and all of them were spectators to a scene I had never imagined would be mine to live. The priest shifted uncomfortably. His voice caught in his throat as he searched for words that could soften the wreckage, but there were none. My bridesmaids stared at me with trembling hands, clutching their bouquets like fragile shields, their painted smiles fading into shock. Somewhere near the front, my grandmother dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, shaking her head as if to ward off the reality that her granddaughter had been left abandoned before God and everyone. And there I stood, the bride who was no longer a bride, a woman draped in white lace that suddenly felt heavy, suffocating, like a costume mocking me with every thread. The bouquet I had once held with reverence now seemed ridiculous in my grasp, an ornament from a play whose leading man had walked off stage. My father's hand reached out again, more insistent this time, trembling with both anger and sorrow, his eyes searching mine for permission to lead me away from the altar. At last, my knees softened, and with slow, deliberate steps, I allowed him to guide me down the aisle, the very path I had imagined walking with joy just minutes earlier. Now, every step became a walk of shame, a descent into the cruel theater of whispers, each face I passed etching itself into my memory, every glance branding me with silent pity. The train of my dress dragged behind me, its once pristine whiteness brushing against the floor like the tail of something already mourned, a ghost of vows that would never be spoken. I could hear the faint clicks of cell phones being slipped out discreetly, the rustle of guests leaning in toward one another, the heavy air of a scandal already being stitched into narrative threads that would spread beyond these walls before the night was over. In that suffocating march, I felt stripped bare, not because my dress exposed me, but because his absence had peeled away the illusion of safety I thought love provided. There was no veil thick enough to hide me from the truth. I had been rejected, not privately but publicly, in the most sacred of spaces, and there was no rewinding the moment, no pretending it had been anything less than a declaration that I was not enough. When we reached the church doors, I paused. My instinct was to collapse, to hide in the shadows, to let the sobs that clawed at my throat erupt and drown me. But I felt every eye burning against my back, and I knew that breaking down then would brand me forever as the victim, the woman left at the altar, pitied and diminished. So I swallowed the tears, forced my face into an expression I barely recognized, and straightened my shoulders. If I was to be remembered, let it not be as the broken woman dragged out of her wedding, but as someone who walked, however wounded, with her head held high. The doors opened, spilling daylight across my ruined fairy tale, and I stepped out into the brightness with all the weight of shame pressing down on me, but none of it visible to the strangers waiting outside. The air was sharp, the scent of flowers replaced by the cruel honesty of the afternoon sun, and the murmurs inside followed me out as though they were tethered to my heels. My mother clutched at me once we were outside, her sobs muffled against the fabric of my gown, whispering apologies that were not hers to make. My bridesmaids gathered uncertainly, their once glittering eyes now dull with discomfort, unsure of whether to comfort me or retreat into their own awkwardness. I caught fragments of conversations, guests already weaving excuses for him, others condemning him, some simply unable to resist the thrill of having witnessed a scene they would recount for years. And I walked among them, each step heavier than the last, knowing that my humiliation was no longer confined to the church. It had spilled into the world, into the hands of those who would retell it, twist it, and never let me forget. The car that was supposed to carry us to the reception sat waiting, its ribbon decorations fluttering in the breeze, its emptiness mocking me with cruel symbolism. I could almost see the life I had envisioned reflected in its polished surface, the smiles, the laughter, the champagne glasses clinking, but instead, I saw my own pale face, drawn tight with grief and disbelief. My father guided me inside, his silence louder than any words, his jaw clenched with rage he could barely contain. The drive away from the church was slow, the weight of failure and humiliation filling the air inside the car so thickly that none of us dared speak. My hands clenched the fabric of my dress, knuckles white, as I fought the urge to tear it from my body, to rid myself of the costume that now bound me to a story of abandonment. But more than grief, more than anger, a seed of something else took root during that silent ride. Clarity. I saw, in vivid flashes, the hours, the years, the sacrifices I had given him, and how, in one calculated betrayal, he had reduced them all to ash. And though my heart screamed to collapse into the abyss of sorrow, another part of me, colder, sharper, began to stir. That part whispered that this was not the end, that humiliation could be turned into power, that even as I walked this road of shame, the story was not finished. I arrived at my parents' house surrounded by pitying eyes and hushed words, but inside me, something shifted. The shame was real, the sting unbearable, but beneath it grew the first threads of defiance. He thought he had walked away to something better. The mistress thought she had won a prize, but neither of them knew that the woman they left standing at the altar would not remain broken for long. And as I sat in silence that afternoon, still dressed in white but already beginning to shed the illusions that had bound me, I realized that this walk of shame was not an ending. It was the beginning of a transformation, one that would soon make both of them regret every step they had taken away from me. She was not supposed to be part of my story, not in the way she inserted herself, not in the way she smiled at me with victory already gleaming in her eyes. For months, she'd been a whisper, a suspicion I forced myself to ignore, the faintest shadow in the corners of our life together, easily explained away by late nights at the office, muted phone calls, and sudden bursts of secrecy disguised as stress. I had dismissed the signs because love makes fools of us, because when you have invested years in someone you tell yourself that the darkness you glimpse is only your imagination, that he could not possibly be capable of betraying the world you built together. And yet, there she was, no longer hidden, no longer an abstract suspicion, but flesh and blood, hair perfectly styled, makeup sharp, dress chosen to impress. She stood at the back of the church the moment he abandoned me, and while the audience gasped in horror, she rose with poise as though she had rehearsed her entrance. She was not ashamed. She was radiant, glowing with the audacity of someone who believed she had claimed her prize. I can still see her in my mind, every detail imprinted because humiliation sharpens memory like nothing else. Her eyes met mine when she followed him out, and in them was no trace of guilt, no recognition of the devastation she had helped orchestrate. Instead, there was smugness, the cruel curve of lips that silently mocked me. She wanted me to see, wanted the entire room to see, that she was the one he had chosen, that the vows meant for me were nothing but ashes at her feet. It was not enough for her to have him in secret. She wanted to dismantle me in public, to make her triumph complete. She thought she had won, and in those first moments, as I stood paralyzed in my gown, perhaps I believed it too. Later, as I sat in the silence of my parents' house, I replayed every interaction I'd ever had with her, the fragments of conversations that had once seemed harmless, but now dripped with meaning. She had been at social gatherings before, introduced casually, always smiling too brightly, always lingering just long enough to make me feel small. At the time, I had pushed away the unease, telling myself not to be paranoid, that women are taught to see enemies where none exist. But hindsight is cruel in its clarity. The laughter that lingered too long, the touches that seemed accidental but were deliberate, the way she asked questions about me as if studying me for weaknesses. All of it had been preparation. I was not merely a bride abandoned. I had been the subject of her silent campaign, and she had succeeded in turning my wedding into her coronation. In the hours that followed, stories trickled in from friends, fragments of information pieced together like shards of glass cutting at my skin. She was not simply an affair. She was a co-conspirator. She had whispered in his ear, fed his doubts, stroked his ego, promised him a love free from responsibility, free from the years of sacrifice and compromise that had built our relationship. She had given him the illusion of youth, of passion unburdened by the weight of shared history. And he, foolish man that he was, believed her. Together they had constructed a fantasy, one that required my destruction to be complete. The wedding was not just ruined, it was transformed into their stage, the moment she could step out of the shadows and declare herself the victor. But what she could not understand, what she had never anticipated, was that humiliation can harden into something far stronger than pain. I watched her claim what she thought was her triumph, and in that claim, she revealed everything I needed to know. She exposed the truth of who she was, and who he had become. She showed me their arrogance, their recklessness, their belief that my silence meant weakness, and in doing so, she gave me the first weapon I would wield against them. That night, alone in my room, still in the remnants of my dress, I stared at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. I was pale, exhausted, hollow-eyed, but within the hollow space something new was forming. I thought of her smirk, of the way she had walked out of the church with her head high, as though she had stolen my crown, and I felt the cold fire of defiance ignite. She believed she had won, because she had him for now, because she had turned my love into her conquest. But she did not see the longer game. She did not understand that victory claimed too soon is nothing but the prelude to downfall. I began to gather pieces in my mind. His patterns, his finances, his weaknesses, the connections that bound him to me still, all the things she could never erase no matter how many stolen glances or whispered promises she gave him. The mistress had positioned herself as the rival who had defeated me, but she had only awakened in me the clarity to see the battlefield for what it truly was. I realized then that her smirk, her triumph, was not the end of my story, but the spark of a new one. She thought she had won, but as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that her victory was temporary, shallow, built on lies and betrayal. And sooner rather than later, both she and the man who had chosen her would discover that the woman they thought broken at the altar was not defeated at all. She was already beginning to plan, already beginning to sharpen the edges of the truth, already preparing for the moment when her supposed triumph would collapse in ruins. And as I lay awake, the echo of her smirk still haunting me, I promised myself one thing. She would never see it coming when the crown she thought she had stolen turned to ash in her hands. Time became a cruel trickster the moment I stepped away from the church, its minutes dragging across my skin like shards of glass, each one reminding me that I was a woman left behind, a bride without a groom, a spectacle of pity. The world outside the ceremony moved forward. The cars drove by. The sun lowered inch by inch, and yet within me, time splintered. Every second felt swollen, stretched into eternity, and I could not find refuge in sleep or distraction. I was suspended in those hours, trapped in the echo of doors slamming and whispers rising, in the smirk of a mistress who thought herself triumphant, in the look of betrayal carved into my memory by the man who had promised forever and delivered abandonment. I sat in my childhood bedroom, the walls painted long ago in colors I had chosen when I was still a girl dreaming of love, and I stared at the ceiling, the silence pressing so heavily that even the ticking of the clock seemed cruel in its insistence that life was moving forward while I remained frozen. My parents tried to comfort me, their words soft and broken, but their voices were like muffled sounds behind glass, reaching me but never truly touching me. I nodded at their reassurances, accepted the tea my mother pressed into my hands, but the liquid tasted like nothing. the steam rising from the cup only fogging the numbness that had settled inside me. My father sat in the corner, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to storm into the night and drag him back by the collar, force him to face the devastation he had caused. But I could not bear the thought. I did not want him back. Not yet. Not like that. I wanted him to stew in the choice he had made, to feel the weight of walking out on me in front of everyone. I wanted him to think he had won, to bask in the illusion of his escape, because only then would the inevitability of his regret taste as bitter as it should. I thought of the guests, of how they were surely still whispering, perhaps gathered in clusters at the reception hall that was never filled, picking apart the story like vultures circling the remains of something once alive. The food would sit untouched, the cake uncut, the music never played. What should have been a celebration of love had turned into an autopsy of betrayal, and I could almost hear their voices dissecting me. Poor girl, left at the altar. How humiliating. She must not have been enough. The shame of it clung to my skin, seeping into my bones. Yet beneath it, something colder was growing. It was the clarity of rage restrained, of pride that refused to crumble, of a spirit that understood that the story was not finished simply because the hours dragged like years. The phone began to ring, messages pouring in like waves crashing against a fragile shore. Friends, relatives, even distant acquaintances who had heard the news faster than I thought possible. Some sent pity, others offered venomous words about him. Some begged me to rest, to cry, to let it out, but I could not. I sat there, dry-eyed, my emotions carved into silence, unwilling to spill tears for a man who had chosen to desecrate what was meant to be sacred. I read their words, I listened to their voicemails, and all I felt was distance, as though their voices were coming from another world. The woman I had been that morning had already died at the altar, and what remained was still forming, raw and unfinished, but undeniably different. As the hours stretched into night, the memories of our years together unspooled like cruel film reels in my head, the vacations where he held my hand and promised that nothing could ever come between us, the nights we stayed up dreaming about the house we would build, the children we might raise, the sacrifices I made, the jobs I declined, the opportunities I set aside, because I believed in him, in us. Each memory was a blade, cutting deeper as I realized how disposable all of it had been to him, how easily he had thrown it aside for the thrill of a mistress who promised excitement without the weight of commitment. And yet, the deeper the cuts, the more I realized that I was not bleeding out. I was hardening. At some point, the exhaustion of replaying every second dulled into a heavy stillness, and I sat in the dark, the only light the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. The house was quiet, my parents finally retreating to their room, their worry heavy in their steps. Alone, I finally allowed myself to whisper aloud the words I had been thinking since the moment the doors slammed. He will regret this. Not whispered as a wish, not spoken as a hope, but declared as a certainty. Because betrayal of this magnitude does not end with triumph. It rots. It festers. It turns against the betrayer until it consumes them whole. The hours stretched on, minutes dragging into eternity, but I held on to that certainty like a rope tethering me to the future. I would not chase him. I would not beg. I would not collapse into the fragile image of the abandoned bride. I would wait. I would sharpen my silence. I would build my strength in the quiet rage of those hours that felt like years. And when he came back, and I knew he would, because men like him always do, I would be ready. By the time dawn threatened the horizon, painting the edges of the sky with pale shades of gray, I no longer felt like the same woman who had walked down that aisle in lace and hope. The sun would rise soon, and with it would come the unraveling of the illusion he thought he had secured. For though he had left me in humiliation, he would return not to the bride he had discarded, but to the woman those endless hours had forged. The night after the wedding that never was bled into dawn, and I had not closed my eyes once. The hours that had stretched like years now collapsed into a strange stillness, as if exhaustion had finally muted the storm inside me. I sat in my childhood room still half-dressed in remnants of that cursed gown, the veil discarded in a corner, the corset loosened but not removed, my hair falling limp from where pins had once held it in place with such care. Outside, the pale light of morning spread slowly across the horizon, creeping in through the thin curtains, painting my skin in muted gray. My body was drained, but my mind remained sharp, alert, attuned to every sound as if waiting for something I could not yet name. The house was silent. My parents had tiptoed around me with the reverence of those afraid to disturb fragile glass. But I was no longer fragile. Something in me had shifted during the long vigil, and though I was exhausted, I felt armored in a way I had never been before. When the knock came, it was almost anticlimactic. A hollow sound against the wood of the front door, muffled by walls but sharp enough to pierce the quiet. My breath caught, my body stilled, and in that instant, I knew. Before my father's heavy steps crossed the hall, before my mother's soft gasp escaped her lips, before the silence of hesitation filled the space, I knew who it was. There are knocks that carry familiarity, knocks that announce themselves with the weight of memory, and this one was his. He had returned. I did not rise at once. I listened as the door creaked open, as my father's voice thundered low and restrained, thick with anger, telling him he was not welcome, that he had done enough damage. I heard my mother's softer pleas, asking my father to lower his voice, afraid perhaps of waking the neighborhood or of escalating the scene. And then I heard him, his voice cracked and broken, pleading, begging to come inside. There was no arrogance left in it, none of the confidence with which he had walked out of that church. His tone carried the weight of regret, of panic, of a man who had already begun to feel the sharp edge of consequences slicing through the illusion he had chosen. When I finally descended the stairs, I found him standing in the doorway, shoulders slumped, hair disheveled, the tuxedo he had once worn with pride now wrinkled and stained, as though he had slept in it, or perhaps not slept at all. His eyes were red, not from wine or lack of rest, but from tears, real tears that streaked down his cheeks with a desperation I had never seen before. The man who had once stood at the altar with me, the man who had turned his back so easily, now looked like a child who had lost his way in the dark. He reached for me, words tumbling from his mouth without structure, apologies spilling over apologies, his voice breaking under the weight of his own shame. He said he had made a mistake, that he had been confused, that she was not what he thought she was, that he had been blinded by something fleeting and shallow. He said he realized the depth of what he had thrown away the moment the doors closed behind him, and I stood there, silent, watching him unravel. Every sob, every tremor in his voice, every tear that fell at my feet was a reversal of the arrogance that had once carried him out of that church. He expected anger, expected shouting, expected the wounded bride to break at last, to either collapse into his arms or lash out in hysterical fury. What he did not expect was the cold stillness that met him. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not move toward him nor away from him. I simply looked at him with a gaze stripped of illusion, stripped of the softness he had always relied upon. It is a strange kind of power, to hold silence when someone begs. His words filled the air, but my silence made them echo louder, bouncing back at him until even he seemed to realize how empty they were. He tried to take my hand, but I did not lift it. He fell to his knees, the man who had once abandoned me kneeling now as though before an altar he had desecrated, his tears darkening the wooden floor. My parents watched in stunned silence, my father's fury tempered by confusion, my mother's pity gnawed at by doubt. But I felt no confusion, no doubt. I felt only the sharp clarity that comes when the scales fall from your eyes, and you see a person as they truly are, not as they pretended to be, not as you wanted them to be, but as their choices revealed them. He kept speaking, kept confessing, each word a desperate attempt to patch the gaping wound he had torn open. He spoke of the mistress, how she had already turned cold, how she revealed her hunger not for him, but for the status, the drama, the spectacle of stealing him away. He admitted that even in her arms he had felt hollow, that the thrill he chased dissolved into emptiness the moment reality set in. He admitted that he had thought of me instantly, that regret had struck him like lightning the moment he stepped beyond the church doors, that every step away from me was a step into ruin. And though part of me had longed for these words once upon a time, I felt nothing now. His tears did not soothe me. His apologies did not move me. His desperation did not rekindle anything in me. For he was not speaking to the woman he had left at the altar. She no longer existed. He was speaking to the woman who had been born in those hours of silence, the one who had walked through humiliation and emerged sharpened by it. So I let him speak. I let him drown in his own words. Let him taste the bitterness of regret on his tongue. And when he finally fell silent, his face streaked with tears, his body trembling from the effort of begging, I lowered my gaze to him and spoke for the first time since he had arrived. My voice was calm, cold, stripped of any tremor, and the words I gave him were not the balm he craved, but the blade he never saw coming. For in that moment, I knew that the true reckoning had only just begun, and that the man who returned to me crying was not ready for what I would say, nor for the path I had already chosen. When my voice finally broke the suffocating silence of his pleading, it did not tremble or crack the way he must have expected. He had likely braced himself for a storm, for shrieks of rage, for sobs that might soften into forgiveness once his arms wrapped around me again. He had imagined that if he came crawling back, shattered and ashamed, the woman he left at the altar would crumble under the weight of her lingering love and offer him a reprieve, because that is how he had always known me, soft in my devotion, patient in my sacrifices, forgiving of his flaws. But the hours I had spent awake in the dark had burned away that softness like fire-consuming paper, leaving only ashes and steel in its place. When I spoke, my voice was calm, so calm it chilled even me, and I watched his face falter as he realized that the warmth he once took for granted was gone. I told him that tears were meaningless when they came only after destruction, that regret was not an apology, but an echo of cowardice. I told him that every word he poured out before me was nothing more than a desperate attempt to claw back the stability he had thrown away, not for love of me, but for fear of the emptiness he found with her. He tried to protest, shaking his head, reaching for me again, but I stepped back, and the rejection was sharper than any scream could have been. He looked startled, as though my distance struck him harder than the collapse of our wedding ever could. There was power in that distance, a power I had never wielded before. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his hands trembled when they no longer had the right to touch me. He tried to remind me of our years together, of the memories we had built, of the promises whispered in the quiet of nights we once shared. But his words slid off me like water against stone. For every memory he summoned, I saw the shadow of that church door slamming behind him. For every promise he invoked, I heard the silence of the altar as he turned his back. For every plea he made, I saw her smirk, her triumph, and I could not unsee it. My father stood in the corner of the room, his arms crossed, his jaw tight with fury he kept contained only for my sake. My mother sat quietly, her face torn between pity for him and pain for me, unsure whether to intervene or let me handle the wreckage myself. But I hardly noticed them anymore. The world had narrowed to just him and me, and the battlefield between us was no longer the aisle of a church, but the quiet of my family's living room. And on this battlefield, I was no longer the one standing in lace and hope. I was the one holding the silence that cut sharper than his mistress's betrayal. When he broke down again, his tears flowing freely, I did not flinch. I let him collapse into sobs, his voice cracking, his apologies circling back into the same meaningless refrain. And when at last he grew quiet, spent from the weight of his desperation, I told him with measured coldness that choices do not vanish just because regret follows them. I told him that he had shown me, before everyone I loved, who he truly was, and that no amount of crawling back could erase the humiliation he had branded onto my skin. I reminded him that he had not only betrayed me, but had conspired with her to make my pain a public spectacle, to turn my vows into ashes while she stood watching with triumph. His face crumpled at those words, because he knew they were true, and for the first time since he arrived at my door, I saw the reflection of his choice carved into his expression with brutal honesty. The silence after I spoke was heavier than the sound of his sobs. He stared at me, wide-eyed, as if he were looking at a stranger, and perhaps he was, because the woman he had known would have softened by now, would have looked at his tears and remembered the warmth of his arms, would have begged for an explanation, and offered forgiveness in return. But that woman was gone, buried beneath the rubble of the altar, replaced by someone colder, sharper, unwilling to ever again be broken so easily. He whispered my name like a prayer, but I did not answer. I let it fall between us, hollow and powerless. I saw then that the true punishment was not in screaming at him, not in driving him out into the night with curses. The true punishment was this: my coldness, my detachment, my refusal to grant him the emotional chaos he sought. He wanted redemption, wanted to believe that if he suffered enough in front of me, the door would open again to the life he had shattered. Instead, I closed that door quietly, without theatrics, without cruelty, only with a cold clarity he could never have anticipated. As he left that evening, stumbling out into the fading light, he carried not the relief of forgiveness, but the weight of rejection he had never thought possible. His tears had not washed away his betrayal. His begging had not softened my resolve. He had returned expecting to find the woman he left behind at the altar, fragile and longing. Instead, he found a stranger forged in the fire of humiliation, a woman whose silence and coldness wounded him in ways no words could. And though he walked away again, slower this time, dragging his regret like chains, I knew this was not the end. His collapse had only just begun. My coldness was the beginning of a reckoning he would never escape, and I would be there to watch as the life he thought he could control crumbled piece by piece. For in the stillness of my detachment, I had already begun to shape the next chapter of his undoing. In the days that followed his return to my door, I carried his tears in silence like a secret I was unwilling to spend too soon. He thought my coldness was the end of it, that my refusal to forgive had been the full measure of my strength. But beneath that surface calm, I was already plotting the shift that would take what had been private humiliation and transform it into a spectacle not of my ruin, but of his. For he had stolen from me more than vows. He had stolen my dignity before the eyes of family and friends, left me to walk down the aisle alone while whispers gathered like vultures. If betrayal had been made public, so too would be his reckoning. And the idea of turning the very stage he had used to break me into the ground upon which he would crumble filled me with a clarity so sharp it felt like breathing again after drowning. I began with silence, the same silence that had unnerved him in my parents' home. But this time it was not a shield. It was a preparation. I answered questions with composure, refusing to confirm or deny the details people hungrily sought, letting curiosity and gossip feed themselves into a frenzy. Whispers thrive on uncertainty, and I let them grow fat with speculation until the time was right. In private, I gathered what I had suspected for months, but never dared to prove. Messages left on shared devices, receipts tucked away in drawers, late-night emails written with too much familiarity, pictures stored carelessly in the cloud. I collected them with precision, each proof another stone in the foundation of what I would build. I knew enough of his patterns to anticipate his next move, his attempts to return not just to me, but to the social circle that had witnessed his betrayal, desperate to salvage his reputation as much as his relationship. He wanted to rewrite the story, to recast himself not as the villain, but as the man who had faltered briefly, and then come back repentant. That was the story he hoped to sell, but I would not let him. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A family gathering, one that had been planned long before the wedding, and now hung over us like a test of how much shame we could collectively endure. He appeared there, uninvited, but expected, dressed carefully in muted tones, his face arranged into contrition. He thought his presence alone would be enough to spark conversation, to allow him to deliver his apologies publicly, to cloak his betrayal in the guise of a mistake that could be forgiven with time. And for a while, it seemed he might succeed. Guests approached him hesitantly, some softening under his downcast eyes and trembling voice, others eager to believe that reconciliation was possible. The mistress, of course, was not there. By then their brief alliance had already begun to sour, her impatience with his guilt too sharp for him to stomach. He was alone, vulnerable, desperate for an opening, and I gave him one, but not the one he wanted. When the room had filled with enough people to serve as witness, when the conversations had reached the gentle hum of comfort that lulls people into thinking nothing dramatic could disturb it, I rose. My dress was simple, black against the muted colors of the gathering, my hair tied back, my face composed. I had rehearsed none of it, and yet every word felt inevitable as I spoke. I thanked everyone for being there, for supporting me in the aftermath of what had happened, and I said his name aloud, my voice cutting through the air like a bell. All eyes turned to me, then to him, and I saw his body stiffen, his lips curve into the faintest smile of hope. He thought I was about to absolve him, to make the public gesture of forgiveness he craved, but I did not. Instead, I unveiled the truth. Calmly, methodically, without raising my voice, I laid out the evidence I had collected, the messages, the receipts, the photographs, the timeline of deception that stretched back long before the day of our wedding, long before the moment he chose her in front of everyone. I spoke of the mistress not as a phantom, but as the accomplice she had been, detailing how their plan had unraveled the life I had built with him. Each word was measured, precise, carrying the weight of proof that silenced any attempt at denial. He shifted, he stammered, he tried to interrupt, but I continued with the cold precision of someone who had already lived through the humiliation and now held all the power. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the sound of his mask cracking. The guests who had once pitied me now pitied him, but not with sympathy, with disdain. They saw him as he was, not a man who had stumbled, but one who had plotted, who had chosen selfishness over love, spectacle over sincerity. I watched the faces around me harden, the whispers begin anew, but this time, they were not daggers aimed at me. They were arrows piercing him. His attempts to protest dissolved into half-sentences, his voice breaking under the weight of what he could not refute. And when I showed the final piece, the photograph of them together on the night he had sworn to be working late, the room gasped as one, and he collapsed into silence. It was in that moment, standing before the same kind of witnesses who had once seen me abandoned, that I turned the tables. The humiliation that had once been mine was now his, multiplied, permanent. He had left me broken at the altar, but I had risen to rebuild myself into something stronger, and now it was he who stood exposed, stripped of dignity, pleading with eyes that found no mercy. I ended my speech not with anger but with dismissal, telling him that this gathering would be the last place he would ever see me as his equal. After this, he was nothing more than the architect of his own downfall, a man defined not by the vows he failed to take, but by the betrayal he could never escape. As I sat back down, the silence lingered like thunder after lightning, and I felt the weight of every eye not on me, but on him. He had wanted public redemption. I had given him public ruin, and as he lowered his head, his body collapsing under the judgment of those he once sought approval from, I knew that the story had shifted irrevocably. The tables had turned, and he was not ready for the life that awaited him on the other side of his own disgrace. What followed after that public unveiling was not immediate chaos, but the slow, inevitable crumbling of two people who had built their bond on deception. For while I sat silent, reclaiming the dignity that had once been stripped from me, he stumbled from the gathering with his face pale, his eyes wide with the hollow look of a man who realized too late that his secrets had not only been exposed but had destroyed any foundation he thought he still stood upon. The mistress was not there that evening, but her absence did not shield her from the fire I had lit. In fact, it made the flames reach her more quickly, because humiliation travels faster than any messenger, and by the time he sought her out the next day, she had already heard whispers of everything. What had once seemed like a thrilling victory for her, the smug satisfaction of standing in the shadows while he abandoned me, was now poisoned by the knowledge that the world knew her name, her role, and the filthiness of her triumph. She had wanted to win him publicly, but now she was marked publicly, and the crown she thought she had stolen turned to ash in her hands. Their implosion began quietly, in arguments whispered behind closed doors, in text messages exchanged with venom instead of longing. He had returned to her after leaving my family's gathering, still wet with the tears he had shed before me, his desperation for comfort driving him back into her arms. But what he found was not the soft embrace of a lover eager to soothe him. It was suspicion, accusation, and rage. She had not wanted a broken man. She had wanted the thrill of conquest, the glow of a prize stolen from another woman's altar. And when she looked at him now, she no longer saw victory. She saw the ruin of her own name tied to his disgrace. She asked him why he had gone back to me, why he had begged at my doorstep. why he had let me strip him bare in front of family and friends without fighting harder. She accused him of weakness, of cowardice, of still loving me in ways she could never compete with. And as he tried to defend himself, his words became circular, defensive, hollow, because deep down he knew she was right. I did not need to witness their downfall to know how it unfolded. The pattern was written in their very choices, and I could see it clearly in the aftermath of that night. He would try to appease her, to cling to her as the only proof that leaving me had been worth something, but she would recoil, sickened by the reminder that she had not won a man but inherited a coward. She would point to the messages now circulating among our acquaintances, the screenshots I had displayed, the evidence I had unleashed, and she would realize that she had not been elevated, but exposed. And so their fights grew sharper, their alliance thinner, until the cracks widened into chasms they could no longer ignore. Friends told me later of scenes they had witnessed. Heated arguments in restaurants, her storming out while he chased after her, their voices carrying into the night with words like mistake and regret cutting through the air. They said she called him spineless, said he had ruined her life as well as mine, said she should have known better than to build her triumph on the wreckage of another woman's wedding. He, in turn, called her manipulative, accused her of luring him into betrayal, of feeding his doubts, of orchestrating the humiliation that now clung to him like a permanent scar. Each of them clawed at the other, desperate to push the weight of responsibility onto someone else, but neither could escape the truth. They had chosen this path together, and now it was collapsing beneath them. Their implosion was not a sudden explosion, but a slow unraveling. Threads pulled loose until the fabric of their relationship disintegrated. The people who once whispered behind my back now whispered about them, their names linked not to romance but to scandal. Their every appearance together met with disdain rather than admiration. She found herself isolated, doors closed to her in circles she once craved entry to, her beauty overshadowed by the stench of being the mistress. He found himself mocked, his career opportunities shrinking as colleagues lost respect, his reputation tarnished in ways apologies could never repair. And between them, the trust that might have sustained their fragile union was gone, replaced by bitterness, suspicion, and regret, too heavy to carry. I watched it all unfold from a distance, not with bitterness, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who had chosen silence at the right time and words at the perfect moment. Their implosion was their own doing. I had simply shone a light on the cracks they had tried to hide. I did not need to confront them again, did not need to insert myself into their downfall, because they were destroying each other more efficiently than I ever could. He had thought she would be his salvation, and she had thought he would be her prize, but together they had built nothing but a fragile house of betrayal that crumbled the moment truth pressed against its walls. The beauty of it, if beauty can be found in ruin, was that I no longer needed to lift a hand. They carried the weight of their own choices like chains, dragging each other down into a pit they could not climb out of. And as they tore each other apart, the world watched not with pity, but with the cruel fascination reserved for those who thought themselves untouchable and were proven otherwise. Their implosion was the final act of the play they had written, and I, once humiliated at the altar, was now only a spectator, my dignity restored, my future unbound from their collapse. But I knew even then that their destruction alone would not be enough. Their implosion was satisfying, yes, but it was not the final justice. For while they clawed at each other in ruin, I still held in my hands the power to ensure that his downfall was not just emotional, but tangible, that the consequences of his betrayal cut deeper than humiliation and regret. The implosion of their bond was inevitable, but the blow that would end him completely, that would be mine to deliver. Humiliation is a heavy burden, but it is fleeting when compared to the slow, grinding weight of real consequences, and this was the difference he never accounted for. He believed that shame would sting for a time, that whispers would eventually fade, that people would move on to the next scandal, and he could quietly rebuild his life in the shadows of regret. But what he did not realize, and what I had every intention of ensuring, was that betrayal on the scale he had committed never remains confined to whispers. It bleeds into every corner of a man's life, stains every opportunity, poisons every reputation. It follows him into boardrooms and family dinners, into friendships and professional ties, until there is no escaping it. He had chosen to make my destruction public, and in doing so, he had opened himself to a reckoning far greater than he could have imagined. It began at work, where his colleagues, once eager to share drinks and slap him on the back, now regarded him with thinly veiled disdain. In the professional world where he thrived on appearances, the story of his betrayal spread quickly, because gossip is currency, and nothing travels faster than the downfall of a man who thought himself secure. Some framed it as weakness, others as cruelty, but all of them agreed on one thing: he was untrustworthy. Who would put faith in a man who could not keep the most sacred of promises, who could walk away from vows at the altar, who could abandon a woman so publicly only to come crawling back in tears days later? The respect that had once smoothed his path evaporated, and with it went the opportunities he had been so sure were within his grasp. Deals slipped away. Promotions were whispered about in past tense. Clients chose other faces to trust. His name, once a key, became a lock. Socially, the fracture was just as deep. Families do not easily forgive public disgrace, and his name became the subject of hushed conversations, even among those who had once welcomed him as a son, a friend, a confidant. My family, who had watched me walk alone down that aisle, closed ranks around me, their loyalty shifting in ways he could not mend. Friends who had once laughed with him now avoided his calls, uncomfortable with the shadow he carried. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors that had once been open closed quietly, and the circles he had relied upon shrank until he found himself alone. The mistress, already unraveling beside him, only sharpened the sting of that isolation, her bitterness feeding his despair, her accusations tearing at the last scraps of his pride. But it was not enough for me to watch him wither in silence. I wanted the lesson carved so deeply into his life that he could never forget the cost of what he had done, and so I acted with precision, not vengeance for its own sake, but justice cloaked in inevitability. I gathered the evidence I had collected, the documents, the receipts, the threads of lies woven too carelessly, and I delivered them not just to family and friends, but to those who had power over his future. Quietly, strategically, I ensured that his employers saw the patterns of deceit, that his clients knew of the duplicity he carried into every relationship, that his facade of responsibility cracked under the weight of undeniable proof. I did not shout it from rooftops. I whispered it into the right ears, let the poison drip where it mattered most. And then there were the financial consequences. He had shared accounts with me once, joint investments made in the naive belief that we were building a future together. But what he had not realized was that the unraveling of our engagement gave me every legal right to claim what was mine, and I did so with ruthless clarity. I closed accounts, transferred assets, secured what belonged to me, and left him staring at balances that no longer reflected the comfort he had once taken for granted. The mistress who had dreamed of living off his stability found herself tied to a man whose wealth was shrinking, whose power was evaporating, whose name brought more scorn than status. The life she had imagined with him was collapsing, not because I raised a sword, but because I simply refused to let him walk away unscathed. The final blow came in the form of social exile. It was not enough for him to lose respect professionally and financially. He had to feel the sting of isolation in the very places where he once thrived. I watched as the same people who had witnessed my humiliation at the altar now turned their backs on him at public gatherings, as whispers followed him through every room, as women regarded him not with desire but with suspicion, as men avoided standing too close lest his shame taint them by association. He became a ghost at his own table, present but unwanted, tolerated only long enough for politeness before being dismissed. The implosion of his relationship with her had stripped him of companionship, and now the collapse of his social standing left him truly alone. And through it all, I did not need to raise my voice. My revenge was not in fire but in frost, in the quiet dismantling of every foundation he thought unshakable. He had left me in a spectacle of disgrace, but I had turned the tables so that his disgrace stretched far beyond the altar, into every corner of his life. He had calculated nothing, believed that regret and tears would be enough to undo what he had done, but he had failed to consider that the woman he left behind would not remain broken. He had failed to imagine that the coldness he once dismissed as shock was the beginning of a strategy that would ensure his ruin was complete. By the time the dust began to settle, By the time he realized there was no path back to the life he once knew, it was already too late. He had lost everything. Not just me, not just the mistress, but the very respect and security he had taken for granted. And as he stood in the wreckage, surrounded by nothing but the echoes of his own choices, I knew that the consequences he had never calculated had finally claimed him. He had thought leaving me at the altar would be the end of my story, but it had become the end of his. There comes a point after ruin when the silence changes. In the beginning, silence was heavy with humiliation, with the weight of whispers and pity. Then it became sharp, a weapon I wielded against him when he returned to me sobbing, a shield I wore when the world waited for me to break. But as the dust settled, silence transformed again. No longer a burden or a blade, but a space I filled with myself. It was in that silence, in the absence of his voice and her smirk, that I began to hear the sound of my own steps, steady and unshaken, carrying me forward into a life that was no longer tethered to either of them. I had walked down the aisle alone. I had endured the weight of every stare, but now I walked into the world taller than I ever had before, not in spite of that day, but because of it. The altar had been a stage of betrayal, a place where the man I loved revealed the hollowness of his vows, but I no longer saw it as the place where I was destroyed. I saw it as the place where I was reborn. It was where the illusions I had clung to were stripped away in one merciless instant, leaving me with nothing but the raw truth of who I was and who I could become. For years, I had been defined by sacrifice, by patience, by the quiet belief that love was worth giving more than it gave in return. I had shaped myself around him, dimmed parts of myself to keep him shining, carried burdens so that he could walk lightly. And yet, when the moment came to prove his devotion, he did not falter. He fled. In losing him, I realized I had not lost love but chains. I rebuilt quietly at first. The wedding dress was folded away, not with bitterness, but with a kind of reverence for the woman I had been when I chose it. She deserved to be honored, even if she no longer existed. The invitations and photographs, the reminders of what should have been, I stored away not to torture myself, but to remind me of the journey I had survived. Then I began to shape the outlines of a new life. I returned to opportunities I had once declined, jobs I had set aside, passions I had let grow dusty while I devoted myself to him. The more I stepped into those spaces, the more I felt the strength of who I had always been returning to me. Sharper now, unyielding. I no longer avoided gatherings. Where once I had feared the whispers, now I welcomed them, because every room I entered, I did so with the dignity of someone who had walked through fire and refused to be consumed. People looked at me differently, not with pity, but with respect. They saw not the abandoned bride, but the woman who had stood at the center of scandal and emerged untarnished, her spine straight, her voice calm, her gaze unbroken. I did not need to tell my story. It was written in the way I carried myself, in the way I no longer flinched from stares but met them head-on. He, meanwhile, lingered in the shadows, his implosion complete. The mistress was gone, their fragile union destroyed by the weight of their own choices. His career withered, his reputation shredded, his friendships dissolved into absence. He existed still, of course, but as a ghost of the man he once thought himself to be. And every so often, word would reach me of how he spoke of regret, of how he told anyone who would listen that he had lost the best thing in his life. But those words did not pierce me. They did not sting. They passed over me like wind against stone, reminders only of how far I had come from the woman who once thought her world ended at the altar. I stood taller now, not because I had exacted revenge, though I had, nor because I had exposed him, though I did. I stood taller because I had survived the spectacle of betrayal and discovered that survival was not the limit. I had not only endured, I had transformed. The woman he left was gone, but in her place stood someone unbreakable, someone who knew her worth not because it was given by a man, but because it was carved from the very bones of her own endurance. Sometimes, late at night, I think of that moment, the hush of the church as the doors slammed, the sound of my own breath as I realized I was alone at the altar. I no longer replay it as tragedy. I replay it as the moment the world stripped away every illusion and demanded I rise. And I did. I rose from that aisle, from that humiliation, from that smirk she gave me, from those tears he shed too late. I rose taller than the altar, taller than the betrayal, taller than the whispers. The story was never about him. Not really. Not even when he made it so by abandoning me. The story was about me. About the woman who walked alone but walked forward. About the woman who took the ashes of a ruined wedding and built from them a throne of her own dignity. And if ever he or she thinks back on that day, if ever they remember the bride they thought they destroyed, they will not see pity, they will not see ruin. They will see the woman who stood taller than the altar, and they will know that their greatest mistake was not leaving me. It was underestimating me.